Series, sebuah platform diskusi pengembangan carbon pricing di Indonesia yang dikelola oleh dua think tank yang bergerak di bidang energi terbarukan dan dekarbonisasi di Indonesia, yaitu Indonesian Center for Renewable Energy Studies dan Director IRIT akan membantu Anda dalam sesi webinar kedua yang bertajuk pembelajaran dari pengalaman EU dalam mengembangkan carbon pricing. Untuk memastikan Anda semua mendapatkan pembelajaran ini secara optimal, maka selain narasumber tetap dari IKRES dan IRIT, hari ini kami juga mengundang kolega internasional kami, Maya Alexandra Detail, yang saat ini menjabat sebagai ETS Leader Expert dari European Commission Task Force for Carbon Pricing and Markets Diplomacy. Mempertimbangkan daftar peserta yang saat ini sudah terdaftar sebanyak 224 orang, lumayan double dari webinar pertama, dan tidak semuanya berada di Indonesia dan berbahasa Indonesia, maka webinar ini akan diselenggarakan secara bilingual. Webinar ini didukung oleh layanan interpretation yang akan dibantu oleh teman-teman interpreter kami. Silakan Anda ikuti instruksi dan dari interpreter yang ada di chat box sekiranya Anda memang ingin menggunakan layanan interpretation ini. Untuk memulai pelaksanakan webinar ini secara resmi, saya mengundang Dr. Surya Dharma, Ketua IKRES, untuk memberikan kata sambutan. Kepada Pak Surya, waktu dan tempat saya persilakan.
Mudah-mudahan bisa didengar suara saya.
Bisa Pak,
Bisa ya?
aman,
Oke, baik.
aman Pak.
Kita bersyukur hari ini kita bisa bertemu kembali pada sesi dialog ya, webinar series Carbon Pricing Dialog dari 8 seri yang sekarang kita masuk seri yang kedua. Setelah 2 minggu yang lalu kita menyelenggarakan sesi dialog yang pertama dari pricing. Sekarang kita masuk sesi kedua, kita akan bicara bagaimana pembelajaran dari berbagai negara, dan hari ini kita mulai dari EU, pengalaman mereka menerapkan carbon pricing atau carbon trading di Uni Eropa, karena mereka sudah melaksanakan carbon trading itu sejak tahun 2005. Jadi cukup lama untuk mereka, dan sekarang bahkan mereka sudah masuk ke fase di mana mereka akan intensif melaksanakan carbon trading untuk dekarbonisasi. Dan saat ini mereka bahkan targetnya itu sudah sampai 59 ya.
Bisa maaf.
Oke. Ya. Nah, ini saya pakai, maaf ini saya pakai ini kamera komputer mungkin kurang bagus ya. Malum nih komputernya yang salah ini Pak Andri.
Siap Pak, silakan lanjut Pak.
Jadi kembali kepada apa yang diterapkan oleh Uni Eropa ya, sekarang mereka sangat intensif pada fase 2025 sampai 2030. Karena itu kita memang pantas kalau belajar dari mereka, dan mungkin nanti kita akan belajar dari beberapa negara Asia Tenggara yang lain. Tapi tidak kali ini, saya kira itu akan masuk pada sesi yang berikutnya, sesi yang ketiga atau sesi yang keempat. Hari ini kita akan tampilkan beberapa pakar, dan khususnya Miss Maja ya, dari Uni Eropa. Nanti kita akan belajar lebih banyak, dan tentu dari kita juga ada pakarnya, ada Bu Kuki yang menjadi pakar yang saya kira dari sejak awal ya, pakar dulu ya. Kemudian ada Pak Paul, beliau adalah Direktur Eksekutif dari KRES, dan saya kira sudah tidak asing lagi, dan kami sendiri dari KRES menyampaikan terima kasih kepada Bapak, Ibu, saudara-saudara sekalian yang bisa berhadir, dan khususnya kepada para narasumber yang hari ini ada Bu Kuki, ada Pak Paul, dan khususnya lagi adalah Mas Mod, Mas Mod ya, moderator kita Pak
Siap
Andri.
Pak.
Andri Martin. Terima kasih sekali lagi Pak Andri. Saya mungkin nanti agak on
Ya,
off
Pak.
ya, karena ada meeting juga yang paralel. Tapi saya akan ikuti dengan seksama apa yang pembahasan kita pada siang hari ini. Sekali lagi terima kasih. Saya kembalikan ke moderator. Kita mulai acara ini. Mudah-mudahan ada manfaat untuk kita semua. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much, Dr. Surya, for your opening remarks. Now let's start the main course of this webinar. Before inviting Maya, please allow me to inform you of her short biography. Maya joined the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action in 2011 and is now the ETS lead expert of the EU Task Force for Carbon Pricings and Markets Diplomacy. During her career, Maya has actively contributed to shaping EU climate policy. Amongst others, Maya has played a pivotal role in revisions and extensions of the EU's emission trading systems and has been involved in the review of the EU's effort sharing regulation or ESR, the land use change and forestry or LULUCF regulation. Maya also has significant experience in international negotiations. She has been part of the EU negotiating teams agreement, and at the bilateral level, she has headed the teams responsible for bilateral relations and carbon markets, aviation, and maritime. I would like now to invite Maya to present the evolution of carbon pricing in the EU ETS within 15 minutes. Maya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to everybody here today about the EU's experience with carbon pricing. As has been mentioned by previous speakers, we have about 20 years of experience with carbon pricing. We've established the EU's emissions trading system in 2005. Since its start, it has evolved quite significantly. We had to adapt it. We had to expand it to make it more and more efficient. And I wanted to share some of the key lessons we've learned over those 20 years. I have a presentation. I'm not sure whether participants can see the presentation.
Yes, they can see now, Maya.
Yeah, okay, I don't know. Okay, yeah, now I see it as well. Great, thank you. Then I would invite you to move to the next slide already. Yes, as I mentioned, the EU's emissions trading system was established in 2005. We are now in our fourth phase. With the start of each phase, we've introduced quite significant changes. There may be small changes happening throughout a phase, but the main design changes happen from one phase to another. And it's really become the cornerstone of the EU's climate policy. It has proven to be a very cost-effective instrument for reducing emissions, and is really our key tool in achieving our climate commitments, be it in terms of the NDC, but also more our domestic targets and long-term targets, such as our climate neutrality target by 2050. And it is really designed in a way to achieve those targets or contributing to achieve these targets. I understand this is the second of these series, so you're probably all familiar with carbon pricing already, but just to explain again, so our emissions trading system is a cap and trade system. So we've put a cap on emissions from those sectors that are covered by the emissions trading system, and those liable entities or compliance entities that are covered by the emissions trading system, they need to cover their emissions through allowances. So they need to basically pay for each ton of CO2 equivalent that they emit. To date, our emissions trading system actually covers 40%. There's a small mistake in the presentation here. So it covers 40% of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions from about 8,500 stationary installations, 400 aircraft operators, and since 2024, we are also covering shipping. And this is where the change in percentage of coverage of emissions comes from. It actually applies in all of the EU's member states. So we have, please go back to the former slide. It applies in the 27 EU member states, plus 3 EEA countries. So that's Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. and it is linked with the emissions trading system in Switzerland. So Switzerland has its own emissions trading system, but allowances can be traded between Switzerland and the EU system. Since we established our emissions trading, we were able to reduce emissions by 50% between 2005 and 2024, and the sectors covered by it. And we have really been able to show thereby that it's possible to decouple emissions from economic growth. So as you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, we've been able to reduce emissions by 32% whilst our GDP kept on growing. There are other benefits that come with emissions trading, so not only the environmental one, but we've also been able to generate significant revenues. We are at over 200 billion euros of auction revenues between 2013 and 2024. And actually, in the latest years of the emissions trading system, we've been able to raise more and more revenues per year. So in 2023 alone, we were able to raise 43 billion euros. And we've also adapted our system that nowadays, all of the revenues we raise through emissions trading are reinvested in the green transition. Something we have learned, and I want to mention very much in the beginning already, is that for emissions trading to be effective, it needs to be complemented with other policies. So you need to set climate targets for it to be effective. You need to set other regulation and standards, for example, for vehicles, housing, etc. And you need to also look at the impact of emissions trading and address the social impact, for example. And you need to support innovation to keep on also supporting the industry. So not only imposing a burden, but also help the industry to actually achieve the green transition and to decarbonize. To show you a little bit how effective the EU emissions trading system is nowadays at reducing emissions. So this is the emissions in 2023 compared to 2022. So if you look at the two last columns, and you see that we've been able to reduce emissions by 16.5% in 1 year. That's really a record in emissions reductions we've been able to achieve. Most reductions have come from the power sector with 24% year-on-year change, and industry with 7.5%. Unfortunately, we still see growth in emissions from the aviation sector. Next slide, please. So now I wanted to take you to the key learnings, because it's not only been smooth sailing since the start of the emissions trading system. We have done mistakes as we designed our system. We had to adjust the system to address some obstacles that we faced. So the very first key message I want to pass is that you really need very accurate and transparent emissions data from the sectors that you're covering for the system to be effective. This is really essential, on one hand, to be able for informed decision making. So to be able to set your cap, you need to know what your emissions are at the time you're setting your cap and where you want to go. When we started with our emissions trading system, we didn't have such emissions data, and we basically set our cap from the bottom up. We looked at the installation, estimated more or less what the emissions would be, and this resulted in a complete over-allocation. So our cap was much too generous, and basically there was really no incentive to be able to different ways in the EU. In the EU, the default way is nowadays by auctionings in auctions. Part of allowances is still allocated for free, and to be allocated for free, you need to know the emissions of those compliance entity. And finally, a key point for having such data is for tracking emissions and the mitigation progress. To basically see whether you're on track with your targets, you need to have that data. So all of this contributes to ensuring the credibility, the effectiveness, and the fairness of the system. Next slide, please. The second point, and it was already a bit hinted at in the previous slide, is the key lessons we learned is that when you set your cap, you need to align it with your targets. So you've previously mentioned that the EU the EU ETS has actually a separate target, a more ambitious target than the overall EU climate target, because it only covers part of the sectors, but we want those sectors to contribute the most to our emission reductions to be on track with our NDC. So within the EU, we have set a target of reducing emissions by 62% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels for the sectors covered by the EU ETS. And this has been a very detailed calculation to see, which sectors need to contribute how much to be on track to achieve the overall EU NDC target of reducing emissions by at least 55% by 2030. We've seen that we need this cap to be absolute. So there should be absolutely no room for the cap to be exceeded. So this is the only way you can ensure that you remain on track to achieving your reduction targets. And also, the cap needs to tighten progressively. So it needs to become stricter and stricter. It needs to become more and more difficult, actually, to achieve this. Well, not that more difficult to achieve the cap, but there needs to be less and less allowances available within the cap. And this is essential to ensure that emission reductions continue to happen over time, but also to ease the transition. So you cannot start with a very ambitious cap in the beginning, because decarbonization should be progressive. Otherwise, it's just too difficult to achieve. And then finally, why it's important to align the cap with climate targets is to have the right price signal. So to have the price, have a carbon price that incentivizes innovation, that incentivizes changes in behavior, etc. And this price signal is also essential for policy certainty. So to be willing to make investments in decarbonization, you need to be sure about your long-term goal. You need to know that you're heading that way and that there will be the price in the long term. In the EU, we have one single cap for all the sectors that are covered by the emissions trading system. And this is important for different points. On one hand, it provides flexibility. So there's flexibility in the sense that you can choose whether you want to invest in decarbonization or whether you prefer to buy allowances by either on the secondary market or the primary market. But it also provides a flexibility in the sense that you can choose. In some sectors, it may be more difficult to decarbonize than in others. So it provides you the certain flexibility to decarbonize first where it's the cheapest to do so, and that's what is meant with cost effectiveness. So emissions reductions in an emissions trading system that covers several sectors with one single cap tend to happen there in the sectors where it's cheapest to do so in the beginning, and then moves on to other sectors as these opportunities are reduced. Having a single cap also helps to establish a consistent incentive for all sectors. It's also much simpler and much more transparent to establish one cap for several sectors than have different caps for different sectors. Because setting a cap is quite a negotiation. And if you start looking into every industry sector, for example, it becomes a very difficult undertaking. And then finally, it's simply important for market liquidity. So the larger your market is, the more trading there will be, the cheaper it will be. So it's a liquidity point of view. Next slide, please. This is just an illustration of the EU ETS cap. I think here on this graph, you can very nicely see how this cap is absolute, how it decreases over time, and how the decrease, so the emission reduction factor, has been strengthened. So in the beginning, the cap reduced year on year by 1.74%. And by now, we are actually at a cap reduction on an annual basis of 4.3%, and we'll be heading towards 4.4% in 2028. On top of that, we have also done major reductions. So in 2024, there will be another major reduction in 2026 to make sure that we're on track with our climate targets. You may wonder why sometimes there's an increase in the cap. This is simply due to the fact that we have expanded the scope of the ETS over time. So, for example, in 2024, we added the maritime sector. That's why you see that in 2024, the cap is higher than actually in the year before. Next slide, please. Then another really key lesson we've learned is that it's important to make the polluter pay. So the EU's emissions trading system really incorporates this principle by the fact that it's made auctioning as the default method of allocations in 2013. So the compliance entities need to pay for the emissions, and they don't receive everything for free anymore. So nowadays, about 57% of allowances are auctioned, and this share is actually increasing over time. And also, we've changed the way we're providing free allocation. So it's now based on performance benchmarks. So we are rewarding those that are the most efficient at reducing emissions. So those that have the best in class, they receive more free allocation than those who are very highly polluting. I also wanted to just outline the advantages that we've seen with auctioning. So we've seen advantage in terms of course, generating revenues that then can be recycled and reinvested in the green transition. Auctioning really incentivizes decarbonization and innovation, and that we've seen, and you may remember the emissions I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. When we looked at emission reductions year on year, we see that most emission reductions happen in the power sector, and that is due to the fact that in the power sector, we don't provide any free allocation anymore. So here, the power sector has to fully auction the emission allowances, and that's where we see that most emission reductions happen. Whereas in the other sectors, there's still free allocation, so in the industry sectors, and we see less emission reduction, less decarbonization. And that's why we've also chosen to now move more and more towards auctioning. So phasing out free allocation and moving fully to auctioning. Auctioning also provides a fair competition, and it provides a very clear market price signal. So ever since auctioning has become our default method of allocation, we have actually started creating the carbon price that is needed for investments. In the beginning, and I have a slide, I will show it later on when I speak more about it. But in the beginning, we simply didn't have a carbon price that had any impact in incentivizing investments, changes in behavior, etc. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, Maya, you still have 3 more minutes.
Yes, that's fine. So in the next slide, I just wanted to show you the importance of flexibility. So to create a well-functioning market and address oversupply and scarcity, we need flexibility. So flexibility is on one hand the trading. So the trading between market participants across different sectors. I spoke to this beforehand. We also allow for banking of allowances. So if you have sufficient allowances to cover your emissions and you actually have more allowances than you need, you can carry them over to the next year, but you cannot borrow from the next year. You've also established a market stability reserve to respond to market conditions. So for example, when we had the COVID crisis, they hit, we had there was less production, there was less industrial activity. So how we have this market stability reserve that looks at how many allowances are in circulation on the market. And when you see that it's above a certain threshold or below a certain threshold, we either take some allowances out and put them into reserve or we put them back in. And another flexibility that is important to highlight is reviews. So what's been important for us is that we have revised the ETS over time to adapt it to the needs. But we also had to learn a difficult lesson with, in particular, international credits. So we've been very generous in the beginning of allowing international credits in for compliance, but we've seen that that was a dangerous thing to do because basically there was simply too much on the market. And again, it had an impact on the price. Next slide, please. So this is just to show you the issue I referred to with the international credits, but also more generally, you see that the graph shows you how the EU ETS carbon price has evolved, and it's now at a much higher level, at a level that really triggers investment in decarbonization measures. But, you know, the different elements I mentioned earlier, for example, the lack of emissions data, the allowing international credits without limits in the beginning, not having a market stability reserve, has all contributed to the fact that the allowance price was very low, and we took different measures to ensure that the carbon price came to the level that it needed to be, and that provides a predictability also for the future. Next slide, please.
1 more minute.
Yes, and this is actually already my last slide. So
Okay.
the importance of using revenues for the green transition. So that's another key message. In the beginning, we encouraged that revenues generated through the ETS were used for supporting the green transition. But now it's an obligation. So it needs to be EU member states, they receive the large share of the revenues of auctioning, but they must spend 100% on climate and energy and just transition purposes. We've also created an innovation fund that is fed through the EU allowances, so and this supports innovation and breakthrough technologies. We have a modernization fund in place that helps investments to modernize energy system in the lower income member states. And we are now creating a separate emissions trading system for housing and transport. And here we have created a social climate fund, really to support the more vulnerable households to address the system. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, last slide is the importance of fairness. So you need to have the same rules apply within, within industry sectors in the EU. So as I mentioned, we have one single cap. We use the same flexibilities, and we need allocation rules that reward first movers. You need also fairness between social groups. So we try to address this through the use of auctioning revenues, through the social climate fund, to a just transition funds. So we really look at using revenues to, help the more vulnerable groups. And then finally, you also need fairness compared to producers outside the EU that don't face a similar carbon price through carbon leakage provisions. Initially, we did that mainly through free allocation, but you may be aware that we are phasing out free allocation, and as we're phasing out free allocation for some sectors, we will introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism that will impose a similar carbon price on products that are imported into the EU. And I think with that, I come to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Maya, for your very insightful, inspiring, and environmental presentation. Now, let's examine the opportunities and challenges of developing Indonesia's ETS in the power sector. Now, I would like to invite Pak Paul Butar-Butar, the Executive Director of ICRES, to present this critical issue within a 15-minute time frame. Pak Paul, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much, Masmud, for allowing me to share my screen. But just a moment, how can I? Why I have? Yeah. Actually, initially, I didn't plan to have a slide, but it is important to show to Maya and our participants as well how the Indonesian that have developed the ETS for power sector. But before that, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang Bapak Ibu sekalian. Assalam sejahtera untuk kita semuanya. So, if we look at the history of the ETS development in Indonesia, and we see, for example, or in the past, government got support from partnership for market implementation to develop a kind of market-based, how do you call it? Market-based instrument for the emission reduction. So it was started already around 2017 and so on, and then start with the MRV system, because as Maya already elaborated, collecting data is very important at the beginning before we designed the ETS. And then after the government tested the ETS and the regulation was issued by 2022, and then the ETS in power sector was launched. And we are now actually in the third year of the ETS implementation in Indonesia. So the implementation of the ETS in Indonesia in power sector was actually mandated by the law number 7, 2021. That in that law there is a specific, let's say, one part that regulate the carbon tax, and then it said that tax will be charged to on the purchasing of goods that contain carbon and on activities that emit GHG. And then in that in that let's say law, it says that a piloting could be done, will be done with the coal power plant. It was the basis, and then the MEMR issued the regulation number 16, 2022, that was used as a basis for the launching of the ETS. And then based on the result of the MEMR actually established a kind of benchmarking how much would be the cap, intensity-based cap that has to be that will be given to the coal power plant based on the type of the technology. For example, on, let's say, if it is mine mouth, if it is let's say based on the capacity and so on. So government has set up the cap based on the benchmark that has been developed last time. And then the first year, ETS was only covering the coal power plant, 99 units, because capacity was starting with 100 mega. And then after that, in the second year, the capacity was lowered to 25 megawatt and above, so that the participant increased to 146 unit, covering about 38 gigawatt of coal power plant. So this is the shares of each let's say participating coal power plant. For example, coal power plant with the capacity between 100 to 400 non-mine mouth, and the total capacity was about almost 13 giga. In 2024, it increased to about 13.3 giga. So that is the participants in the ETS. So the thing is, during this time, for example, the transaction in 2024, there were only 72 transactions involving about 5.4 million ton of CO2 in the volume, with the average price of only 10,000 per ton CO2, or about 0.6 cent per kilowatt hour. So compare that to what I've shown by Maya before. The price, the carbon price in the EU could reach even almost 100 euro per ton of CO2. So this is the main difference, and it has to do with the how we set the cap and so on. So. And government also have developed the roadmap for the implementation of the carbon pricing of the ETS in the power plant. And you see here, for example, it started with only coal power plant on grid, and later on it includes off grid. This year should include already off grid, captive, and so on, but also include the gas power plant. And later on, there will be a diesel power plant starting 2028. So government has already a plan how to do that to cover the whole power plant. And this is the emission intensity benchmark that have been let's say developed by MEMR before. For example, if the capacity is above 400 megawatt, we can see here the intensity is let's say take it's about 0.92 or 93 and so on. That's the average. We have here the number based on capacity, and then the allowance that will be given to the power plant will be calculated based on this formula. So the allowance or the cap, in our case, cap and allowance will be put at the same time. So not like in you have differentiated between cap and allowance. So here we have we calculated based on the sectoral emissions divided by plant emissions intensity from previous year and calculated with the plant emissions from the previous years. That would be the cap for the next year. So, and we see that from here, for example, as everyone know that to be effective, then you really have to set the cap, let's say quite strict, so that you create a certain scarcity, so that it also will show you how or it would indicate how the price would be that could be determined later on based on the scarcity of the allowance that the government provided to the let's say plant owner. So, and this is the issue that we have now. So one of the main issues that we have in Indonesia is that the electricity is subsidized. So how can we really on one hand actually implement ETS, charge the coal power plant actually or fossil-based power plant with the emission or carbon, charge them with the carbon price for their emissions, and then at the same time actually we subsidize them. That's one thing. The second thing is in the PPA that we have government enforcement through to PLN. That then PLN will pass that through to the government. Then at the end, our carbon pricing will actually increase the subsidy. And then if we set the cap too low, if we set the cap too tight, then this is actually the thing that would increase the cost, because automatically the cost for the coal power plant will be increased. As with Maya and other participants here, how we really should develop the ETS in Indonesia for power sector, and more actually how we should develop let's say the ETS for the whole sector, so not only for the power sectors. So
excuse me, Bang Paul, you still have 5 more minutes.
No, I actually will stop here, and I will be happy to discuss later on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Bang Paul. Thank you so much. Very informative and insightful presentation. Baik, sekarang izinkan saya mengundang tanggapan berikutnya itu dari Ibu Kuki, Direktur Eksekutif IRIT. Kepada Ibu Kuki, waktu dan tempat saya persilahkan.
Oke, terima kasih banyak Mas Moderator. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
teman-teman semuanya. Iya, barangkali saya nggak terlalu banyak ya yang ingin saya sampaikan, dan mungkin ini lebih menarik dari apa yang tadi disampaikan oleh saya boleh manggilnya Mbak ya, Mbak Maya, dan juga barusan Bang Paul gitu. Karena tadi yang disampaikan dari pengalaman Uni Eropa begitu ya, kan menarik gitu. Ternyata prosesnya lama nih, udah dari 2005, sekarang 2025, jadi sudah 20 tahun, dan prosesnya lumayan gitu ya, sempat naik, sempat turun gitu, menambah sektor dan sebagainya. Dan kita juga tahu, barusan Bang Paul sampaikan gitu, di Indonesia ini baru satu itu di ketenaga listrikan, dan ternyata berbeda gitu. Kalau di Uni Eropa dia allowance-nya dan cap-nya itu absolut, di Indonesia sejauh ini sifatnya intensitas gitu. Nah, yang menarik terakhir sekali tadi slide-nya Mbak Maya menyampaikan bahwa yang sekarang dilakukan itu kan yang free allowance semakin lama akan semakin dikurangi gitu ya. Sehingga yang terjadi itu salah satunya adalah upayanya untuk mengimbangi dari luar, itu akan diberlakukan CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Ini kita tahu juga di Indonesia salah satu yang mengantisipasi CBAM itu adalah sektor industri gitu. Jadi dalam beberapa kesempatan, dalam beberapa public exposure gitu ya, kita juga sering mendengar Kementerian Perindustrian misalnya juga menyampaikan bahwa sebagai antisipasinya Kementerian Perindustrian ini juga sekarang mulai mendiskusikan, mulai memikirkan untuk membuat ETS gitu ya, yang mungkin bisa align dengan ETS yang ada di Uni Eropa. Supaya apa? Supaya dia juga produk-produk industri Indonesia yang diekspor ke Uni Eropa itu bisa mendapatkan dapat keringanan gitu ya, yang setara karena dilihat ETS atau carbon pricing yang berlaku di Indonesia untuk produk industri ini setara begitu dengan apa yang berlaku di Uni Eropa. Jadi ini saya rasa satu hal yang mungkin menarik dan Indonesia mungkin bisa belajar banyak juga gitu ya, bagaimana paling tidak untuk yang di industri ini membangun ETS-nya gitu. ETS yang seperti apa kalau misalnya kita mau membangun ETS untuk membantu produk industri ini, apakah memang hanya fokus di industri aja atau dia juga tadi Bang Paul terakhir ya, Bang Paul juga menyampaikan apakah dia juga harus beberapa sektor gitu, lintas sektor begitu, supaya tadi kan salah satunya likuiditasnya gitu ya bisa lebih, pasarnya lebih kuat gitu. Itu dan juga barangkali nanti kalau kita boleh diskusi, kalau saya boleh juga tanya nanti ke Mbak Maya gitu, sebetulnya apa sih plus minusnya gitu ya, dan bagaimana sebetulnya kita menjawab tantangan-tantangan antara allowance yang basisnya intensitas dan allowance yang basisnya absolut ini gitu. Itu yang saya rasa mungkin ya kita ini di Indonesia karena memang baru mulai juga gitu ya perdagangan karbon atau nilai ekonomi karbon secara keseluruhan gitu, barangkali kita bisa belajar banyak dan saya rasa ini kesempatan bagus banget untuk kita belajar mulai dari yang pertama tadi Bang Paul udah sampaikan gitu, membangun sistem data sih sebenarnya ya, bagaimana membangun sistem data mulai dari pengumpulannya terus pelaporan gitu ya, all the way sampai verifikasinya, sampai sistem seperti apa sih perdagangan emisi yang paling pas buat kita gitu. Ya terutama kalau saya lihat contohnya karena tadi terakhir itu punchline-nya tuh SIBAM gitu ya. Untuk industri kita tuh seperti apa sih yang bisa kita bangun juga supaya ya win-win lah begitu. Mungkin itu kali Mas Mot yang bisa saya tambahkan. Terima kasih Mas Mot. Mungkin diskusi aja kita supaya lebih seru. Kayaknya udah banyak juga kali yang mau nanya. Makasih.
Baik, terima kasih banyak Bu Kuki atas tanggapannya. Ya, memang tapi izinkan saya sebelum memulai sesi Q&A yang melibatkan audiens, izinkan saya karena saya tangkap baik dari Bang Paul dengan Ibu Kuki itu punya pertanyaan sebetulnya ya yang ingin dijawab oleh Maya. Nah, eh, apakah tapi saya memberi kesempatan lagi kepada baik Pak Pol maupun Ibu Kuki mau di-refresh pertanyaan spesifik sehingga memudahkan Maya nanti menjawab. Jadi setelah selesai baru kemudian kita buka Q&A session. Saya persilahkan mungkin ke Pak Pol dulu mungkin untuk memfresh lagi pertanyaannya.
Ya, makasih Mas Maud. Maya, you elaborate before the a kind of key success factor for the let's say for introduction of the ETS in EU based on what you have experiences. But one of the basic question that we had, for example, you have in the beginning you differentiate between carbon tax that go to the transport and household, that's for purchasing the fuel, for example, and then you start with only certain sectors in the ETS. Why do you choose this route? Why EU choose actually this route? Let's say, for example, the transport and household used carbon tax at the beginning, but now actually even in the EU ETS, actually also start looking at the ETS for the transport sector, and then the process of, let's say, developing the EU ETS from the beginning. What is actually the what are you struggling with? What were you struggling with in the process that you actually at the end get all parties supporting the EU ETS? That's the question from my side. Thank you.
Baik, terima kasih banyak Bang Paul. Mungkin biar lebih efektif, saya tawarkan dulu ke Ibu Kuki, biar gampang nanti langsung dijawab tuntas sama Mbak Maya. Silakan Ibu Kuki.
I think it would be better for Maya to respond it first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Maya, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much, and very good questions. So coming to your question on why we started with certain sectors and expanded over time, I think it was simply of what was doable. So we couldn't start with everything. We said also you needed emissions data. So in the beginning, we simply didn't have any data. So we decided, let's look at those sectors we know are highly emitting, and let's focus on those. And you know, we had some information in terms of the company's installation space, because you know you need permitting, etc. So we had some basic information already at hand, and we could build on that to set up our system. I think that's the easy answer. It was just of what was doable, I think, in the beginning. I didn't actually mention that when I started my presentation, but our system, the EU ETS 1, so our initial system, is very much a system that is regulated relatively downstream, so at installation level. So not even company level, but installation level. So where production happens. And why did we do that? It was simply because also from a monitoring perspective, we realized this was the easiest way for us to be able to manage the system. And key issue we had, in particularly when looking at buildings and transport, so in particular car transport, was that simply we couldn't go at such a low level. And that's why we decided now that we see that, you know, I think something we have seen is, I mentioned before, that the EU ETS is one of the climate policies that we have in the EU. We have different policies. We have, for example, something we call the effort sharing regulation, which covers the sectors outside the EU ETS. But we saw the emissions reduction didn't happen at the speed, or it didn't actually even happen. And we saw that whilst the ETS was very effective at reducing emissions, the other policies weren't as much. So there's been a demand from the member states, because through the effort sharing regulation, we actually impose the obligations on the member states to, you know, reduce emissions in those sectors outside the ETS to a certain degree, but leave it to the member states to decide how they want to do it. And actually the member states then came back and said, can you please include an emissions trading system, because it's more effective to do so. But then when looking at it, we realized we cannot do it downstream as we do for the EU ETS 1. We need to do it more upstream. So, you know, the fuel sellers rather than the individual car driver. And that's why we keep those two systems separate, because the level at regulation is different. But in short, basically, that was the main reasoning behind why we chose one as opposed to the other. That's the question I noted. I noted from early on, you also had a question on the electricity market and how to deal with, you know, as in Indonesia, where you have a heavily regulated market with force majeure rules, etc. I must admit that's the $100 question. And I must admit, I think Indonesia didn't choose the easiest sector to start with an ETS with. Because I fear, to be more effective, you would need basically a reform of the energy market, which is, you know, I said, you know, emissions trading is never policy, you know, should never be a self-standing policy. It's part of a broader package of policies, and they must be mutually supportive. And I admit, even in the EU, we have certain policies that don't necessarily work hand in hand with the EU ETS. You know, we still have, you know, tax rebates, etc., for fuels and so on in certain sectors. So I think the issue is you need to basically make sure that all policies work together, and that's a key issue in how to address it. Having said that, I think the way it's planned, that the Indonesian ETS will expand the scope in the power sector. So, you started with coal power plants that are connected to the grid. You're going to add, you're broadening the scope to others. That's all going to already going to help you, because I think the initial issue was you only covered the likes. Whereas when I made my presentation, I explained it was important to have a broader system covering different sectors, so that actually you could reward the more efficient ones. But if you only have the same type of compliance entities, participants participating in the system, well, then one is the same is competing with the same, and there is actually no competition, and you just pass on the cost. Whereas if you broaden and become, it becomes more competitive, and that will already hopefully help. But of course, with the force majeure clause, that will always remain an issue. It will always, in a way, undermine the effectiveness. So that's something that would need to be looked at. Yes.
Oke, thank you so much Maya. So before sebelum saya berikan kesempatan kepada Bu Buki, saya informasikan kepada para audiens tercinta bahwa Anda bisa menuliskan pertanyaan di chat box itu nggak harus dalam bahasa Inggris ya. Anda tetap bisa pakai bahasa Indonesia karena kita punya interpreter, sehingga ketika saya bacakan kepada Maya, itu interpreter kita akan membantu mentranslasikan pertanyaan Anda dalam bahasa Indonesia ke dalam bahasa Inggris. Jadi jangan khawatir bahwa Anda bisa bertanya, menulis pertanyaan Anda di chat box itu dengan bahasa Indonesia. Baik, silahkan Ibu Kuki, saya berikan waktu dan tempat.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Maya, my question is more on the allowance, right? You're mentioning about intensity-based as well as absolute-based allowance, right? So what would be the plus and minus of each, right? While, for example, like talking about let's say, country like Indonesia that's still developing, especially mostly talking about the production sectors, right? On the one hand, if it is intensity based, then somehow it will quote unquote accommodate the development process, right? While if it is absolute, then maybe in terms of the let's say the intensity, it's already like relatively low emission per product, per output, but the production is high. So in terms of like the absolute emission is still kind of high. So then, like in terms of the allowance in a year, then it seems very high, but because of the production. So how do you see that? I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, like, if that also come into the, during the process in the EU, whether you also discuss about this dilemma, intensity and absolute in terms of the production and output as well. Thank you.
Maya, before you, sorry, Masmod, before you, Maya answered the question.
Adding to that.
I want to add to that because, as you know, in the on-grid system, and it is the dispatch center actually that regulate how much energy that will be delivered by one power plant. So because we don't have any market that everyone could sell as much as they can if the price is okay. But in our case, actually, it depends on the dispatching center. That's why it would, to my opinion, it might be difficult actually to change from intensity to absolute because these particular issues. Thank you.
So please, Maya.
Yes,
The
thank
floor
you.
is
And
yours.
thank you. This is indeed, again, a very, very good question. And I think, again, putting you back at the core issues of, the Indonesian ETS. I think let's start with what we've seen in the EU is we have seen that decarbonization does not prevent economic growth. So that's the slide I showed before. So since 1990, we reduced emissions by 32%. And at the same time, our GDP grew by almost 70%. So I think it's already, to address the concerns, I think that's already one important element to bear in mind. Then from how I understand the cap is set in Indonesia, I understood you basically, it's all free allocation for the moment, and you basically calculate allowance, the free allocation, or the allocation you give to each participant. And I think here it's interesting to maybe look at the EU benchmark that we use, or how we do benchmarking in the EU to distribute free allowances. Because what we do is actually a combination. We look at the historical activity level. So we look at the output, but we combine it with a performance benchmark. So I think that may be something that may help you to make the system more efficient. So we look at what are the best in class? The most efficient at producing, who are the most efficient at producing this amount, and let's reward them more. And let's not only look at the activity level in the past, but let's combine it together. And I think that's quite something that might be quite useful for you to do, that you do both aspects. So you look at history, but you also look at efficiency. I think that's really the key point I would make here. Then I think there's also another element that it needs to be borne in mind, and that's not really for the power sector, because that's not really what you're going to export, but it's for the industry sector, is there's more and more demand for green products. So actually, if you help decarbonizing your industry, you will help it to make it more competitive on the global market. And that's really something we also see within the EU. There's discussions on developing green steel labels, etc. And if you help your industry now already at decarbonizing, it will be in the long term more beneficial to them, even if it may seem more complicated now.
Okay, thank you so much, Maya. So now let's give the opportunities to our audience to ask directly to Maya and also to Pak Paul and Ibu Kuki. So I will ask 4 questions per session. So now we have 4 questions. First from our anonymous attendee. Hello, Mbak Maya. Thank you very much for your presentation. The progress of auctioning allowances is very interesting. Could you please explain how these allowances work and how they work in allowances to generate revenue for EU member states? That's the first question. And the second question, hi Maya, thanks for the excellent presentation. Regarding the CBAM, Russia has complained to the WTO dispute system. Perhaps you could enlighten us on what is disputed about CBM design or carbon price design. Many thanks, Maya. That's the second question. The third question from Dr. Amir Fikri from Binus Business School. Ms. Maya, critics argue that the carbon price in the EU ETS is not high enough to provide a strong incentive for emission reductions, and some sectors still receive free allowances, creating a competitive disadvantage for others. My question is, or are, first, how does the free allowance allocation system in the EU ETS affect competition between different sectors? My second question, what are the potential impacts of a low carbon price on greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts in the EU? My final question, how could the EU ETS be improved to increase its effectiveness in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? That's the first question addressed to Maya and other resource persons. So maybe I will give the opportunity first to Maya to respond these first 4 questions. Please, Maya.
Thank you very much. Maybe starting with the auctioning and how it works. So, of course, I mean, the EU is more complicated in the sense that, it's an international system. As I said, there are 30 countries basically participating in it. So I will simplify a bit how the process works. So basically, when we set our cap, we create the total amount of allowances that are available within that cap, so that we do at a central basis. And then we say, this share of allowances is available for free, and we allocate it based on benchmarks. I explained it briefly early on. And the other share, we auction on the market. So what does that exactly mean is that on a regular basis, and we're being very transparent in terms of the amount of allowances that we put up for auctioning, when we put them up for auctioning, etc., we basically say, we sell these allowances, and participants in this case is not only compliance entities, it's also people that would wish to just trade, so they don't have any compliance obligations under the system, but they just want to trade, like, for example, banks. They can buy the allowances, either to meet their own compliance obligations or just to hold them on for now and then sell them on more at a higher price later on. So it's really a market. So basically, we put these allowances up also on a regular basis, a certain share of the overall allowances that are available. And then the participants or the auction participants just put in their bids for the auctions and say the price they're ready to pay. And then basically the allowances go to the highest bidders. And of course, they put in a price. So that's the revenue that is being generated through the auction. And most of these allowances, they go to the member states. But as I said, they're also part of the revenues that are generated that go into the funds that we have created, be it the Innovation Fund or the Modernization Fund. But that's a smaller share of it. But most goes to the member states, and the member states then actually generate them. It's a bit complicated to explain how we then, because we actually give a share of the allowances basically to the member states to auction, but it's a complicated system because it's an international system. But in easy words, it's basically at the central level, we have these amount of allowances that are available for auctioning. We don't auction all of them at the same time. We auction them gradually over time. We're being transparent in terms of the frequency that we do it, the amount that we put available, and then bidders just put in their offers for the allowances. On CBAM in the dispute, so CBAM is quite a new kid on the block. So basically, in simple word, what we're doing is, so we have this carbon price that's relatively high in the EU, and to protect our industry from carbon leakage or from our industry to emitting more elsewhere, to provide this carbon leakage, we basically put a price on products from certain sectors that enter the EU. So basically, we put the same carbon price as we have in the EU on the products that are being imported. In our view, we're fully WTO compliant, so we don't make a distinction between origin. We don't make it carbon intensive than the EU products. They're still at a competitive advantage compared to EU products. So in our view, it's completely fair in line with WTO rules. But of course, I mean, for example, Russia sees it as a sort of measure that disadvantages products that are being imported in the EU, because without the CBAM measure, there would not be the carbon price that is factored into it. Whereas for us, it's an environmental measure that is absolutely necessary for the global good, for the global, reduce global greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And yes, on the question on the carbon price, you have seen the EU carbon price has evolved significantly. And I think our key issue in the beginning of the EU ETS was very much the fact that the carbon price was simply too low. We were at times at levels of below €5. And €5 is not what you need. I mean, with €5, you're not going to decarbonize your company. It's just not enough to put the price signal to make investments to go for more, either to promote innovation nor to make any sort of investments in your industry to become greener. And we've done different measures to get the carbon price to a certain level that we believe is high enough to incentivize decarbonization. At the same time, it's not a tax. It's not a fixed price. It's still determined by the market. And why do we do so? It's also to allow, basically, if you give that you let the market decide, it also adapts a bit on the market conditions. So if, for example, the industry is not doing well, the carbon price automatically becomes a bit lower. And that also eases the pressure on the industry at that moment. And that we consider as a very important element of the emissions trading system, that it does recognize the overall market conditions. So I mentioned COVID before. So when the pandemic hit, in itself, the price should have, went a bit down. But of course, we do also, as I said, we have this market stability reserve that is in place. And that kicks in just to prevent that the price gets too low or too high. I mean, too high, it doesn't set an overall price floor nor a price cap, but it does at least provide the necessary liquidity on the market. So it makes sure that the market is not oversupplied, but it also ensures that the market is not undersupplied, so that there's sufficient offer, but that there's not too much offer either. Yes, a load, I mean, it's quite self-evident that if the carbon price is not high enough, you don't make the necessary investments, you don't trigger innovation anymore. So that in itself has a negative impact on decarbonization, on overall climate goods. And then on the questions on free allocation and how it affects competition, well, we apply the same free allocation rules per sector. So that's, we have different benchmarks depending on sectors and subsectors, but in itself, the rules between those that are actually competing are the same. So I think that's an important element to bear in mind. But of course, for example, with the power sector, we've seen that all the costs have been passed through the consumers, and that they absolutely didn't need, and that they weren't exposed to the risk of carbon leakage, so they really didn't need any free allocation. And that's why we very quickly phased out free allocation for the power sector. And finally, how do we plan to further improve the EU ETS? Well, I think in itself, we've done a lot already in the EU ETS, and it's getting, I mean, there's more and more scarcity of the market. So now what we're actually looking into for the next phases is, on one hand, we will have to align our cap with our new climate targets. So we are in the process of developing our 24 climate targets. So we have a review coming up in 2026. And the key element of that review will be, how do we align the ETS cap to meet the 2040 targets? So that will require, again, a change to the reduction factor, for example, or big increases to the cap at specific moments. So that's one element to look at. We're also looking at, for example, the inclusion of municipal waste in the system. So an expansion of the system, that's one element we're looking into. But then, as I said, there's also the scarcity element. And here there is where we're going to start looking into also the possibility of allowing for permanent removals into the system. So that's something we're considering. For the moment, that's not possible, but we're looking into it. So I think that's the elements we're looking at now for the next phase of the use emissions trading system. I hope I answered all the questions, but feel free to come back if I left something unanswered.
You're muted, Mas Mod.
Okay, thank you so much, Maya, for your comprehensive response. So in order to give a chance to Maya to breathe for a little time, so I would like to, because this is, I believe that these issues like free allowance, actioning allowances, CBAM, and also the carbon price is also important issues in the development of carbon pricing in Indonesia. So I invite Pak Paul and Bu Kuki to give comments of these four important issues in the context of development of carbon pricing in Indonesia before I open the second sessions of the Q&A session. So Pak Paul, the Floor is yours.
Thank you, Mas Mod. Actually, in the Maya explanation, actually, it includes already some aspect. Pricing is one very important issue. That's why it becomes a problem actually when it comes to the power sector in Indonesia, especially when it comes to the on-grid. So as I mentioned in my slide, the transaction in 2024, each ton cost only about 10,000, while if we compare that to the EU ETS last time, the cost the price even reached around 100. So, and then if we look at the carbon tax that has been implemented in Sweden, for example, was it Sweden? I think it's Sweden, that it reached around 130 something per ton of CO2. So if the price is not high enough, then I don't think so that there will be actually, let's say, effort from the installation owner to really decarbonize their installation. Instead, they just buy the allowance or buy carbon credit to offset, right? So that's why it becomes very important for us to look at the pricing. So, and that's at the same time actually the complication with us with our on-grid system. So if we, as I mentioned in my slide before, so if we, let's say, set the cap too tight, there is a potential that actually it increase the subsidy, the government subsidy. So that's the contradiction. So what should we do? So we might need to look for another way how we really need to set up the cap for the on-grid power sector. For example, in the PPA between PLN and IPP, they also determine the so-called heat rate. So the heat rate that need to achieve in every capacity factor, right? So then we might be actually obliged the power plant owner to always meet the heat rate at all time. So, but it needs actually quite significant effort to monitor this heat rate. So, and if we based on the cap on the heat rate, then we don't have the issue with the intensity, but we could really just monitor the heat rate, and we might even also let's say improve the heat rate so that they feel the tighten of the cap at the same time. So this might be a kind of way out in our situation because it is under their contract. However, this is the problem now, the complication that I know our colleague from Myanmar, they are now trying to look at how they should regulate the captive power plant. In particular, because the data is not sufficient from they don't have sufficient data collected yet from the captive. But the second thing is, so Maya mentioned that the carbon price, the ET has to be fair for everyone. So how can we make it fair if we, let's say, want to compare or to set the same basis for on-grid and off-grid? So on the on-grid, while it is related to subsidy and so on with the government force majeure issue in the PPA, while the captive actually, they don't actually even receive subsidy, means government basically could set up the absolute cap for the captive, following the way let's say EU have regulated the power sector. So this is the complication now. But if government do that, and there is no fairness in the game. So this is the issue now that our colleague in Myanmar space when it comes to how to regulate the ETS in Indonesia. And to Maya's comment, indeed, we have chosen the most difficult, let's say, sector to start with. In one of our report last time, we actually proposed to start with the cement sector instead of power sector. Because in the cement sector, let's say, the increase of cost due to the carbon price is actually not so high, so that this increase of cost could actually pass through to the consumers. While in the case of PLN, especially on the on-grid, they cannot pass the cost to the consumers because it is regulated by government and has to be approved by the parliament even. So this is the complication. So that's why if there is a question, for example, how to make the ETS in the power sector effective, then I agree with Maya, we really need to look at the energy market first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bang Paul. Ibu Puki, do you have any comments or answers for this audience questions? The floor is yours.
No, not in particular, but maybe this maybe somehow also not directly related to the question, but maybe question to Maya too, or maybe checking to Maya, because in Indonesian case, there is a space for the ETS to use the offset. So how do you see that? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Maya, my understanding in the EU system, there is no space for using offset. So how do you see that, and what would be your, like your suggestion or your views on the use of offset in the ETS? Thanks.
So
Okay,
indeed,
that's actually in line with the thematic of the second question about the voluntary market. Do you want to add combine with the audience question, or just respond to Cookie's question directly?
Okay.
could you maybe just repeat the the question from the audience? So that, because I don't manage to follow the chat
Okay.
well.
Okay, so that's the first question from Cookie about the role of the offset, and the related question comes from Kus Heruwibowo in bahasa. Please assistance from interpreter. Seberapa efektifkah implementasi mandatory market atau carbon trading yang berlaku pertama untuk power generation ini? Apakah ada rekomendasi dari panelis? Karena apabila ini tidak ada perbaikan implementasinya, apakah mungkin yang voluntary market bisa berjalan efektif dan menarik bagi stakeholder lain yang mau terlibat? Itu yang pertama. Lalu kemudian there's still another related question about the offsetting. To Maya, how do you see the role of voluntary market in this area and its impact to the success of ETS? For instance, some companies may instead purchase carbon credits from voluntary market as these are relatively cheaper. However, I understand that offsetting voluntary credit against compliance credit would depend on policies of jurisdiction. I think that could add with Ibu Cookie's question for your response, Maya. So please.
So yes,
the
indeed,
floor
I
is
will.
yours.
Yes, I will address the question on the offsets. So I think first of all, it's important to distinguish between the different type of offsets. So we have, of course, the domestic offset, so which could also be the voluntary carbon markets, and then there's of course international offsets as well. Now with Article 6 before CDM. So in the EU, we never allowed for domestic offsets. However, at some point we allowed for using international credits to use them for compliance. And as I said in the beginning, we were quite generous. We didn't have many limitations on it. And that meant that our system was completely over allocated. And that's also when you saw the graph with the price, basically our price went below €5. It was close to €1 because the CDM price at the time was also below, can't remember the exact amount, but below $1. And that's simply not the carbon price you need if you want to trigger any decarbonization. So basically, it really undermined the effectiveness of our ETS. And as I said, I mean, we learned as we went on. So I think also when you are the first one to start an emission trading system, you probably also go through more mistakes and face, you realize things that you didn't think of because nobody else has gone through it before. So we went very quickly at imposing both quantitative and qualitative restrictions on international credits. And we're now in the fourth phase. We don't allow for any international credits for compliance and no domestic offsets either. Why is that? Simply because we see there is sufficient potential to still decarbonize in the sectors that are covered. So we see that our industry, the sectors that are covered, are still able to reduce to achieve the climate targets without the need of any domestic or any form of offset from the voluntary market, international market, whatever. But this maybe have to be revisited, and I refer to the possible role of permanent removals in the future. So this, as we reach a certain level of scarcity in our market and reach a limit of what is possible in terms of decarbonizing, because now I think we decarbonize where it's easy to reduce emissions. Now it's with the emissions that are left are the hard to abate sectors, and there's always these residual emissions that we will not be able to eliminate. And that's when you will need to, when offsets need to come in. But of course, that needs to be a very careful consideration, and that's something we're slowly starting to look into. It's not going to happen before 2030 in any case. It's not going to happen before our next phase of DTS, or phase 5. But for phase 5, we start to realize there may be, there may be too much scarcity, the price may be too high, and we may need to give a certain role to offsets to keep it possible for our industry to survive with an ETS. But for now, it's not necessary. Our industry is doing well without the offsets. And I think there's always a balance to be found in how much, I think if you can have a voluntary car market that helps you to reduce emissions or have removals, that helps the overall decarbonization of Indonesia, I think that's something, then it may be legit. But I think it's a very careful modeling exercise, and you need to have very, very robust methodology standards in place for the voluntary market for it to be effective. You need to be sure, you need to be sure that the offsets help you the overall decarbonization. So in the end, I think it doesn't really matter where the decarbonization happens. Does it happen in your ETS? Does it happen in ETS? As long as you're decreasing emissions and overall decreasing of emissions in Indonesia. But it requires a very careful analysis of the potential, where it's cheapest to do so, etc. Trust the system, and are you able to verify it? Are you able to keep control of what's coming in to the system?
Okay, so now we open the second questions, and actually one question directly addressed to Maya, and remaining question is for all panelists. For Maya, in bahasa, pertanyaan ke Ibu Maya, saat ini berapa nilai pajak karbon dalam euro atau satuan ton termasuk di UK? Instalasi apa yang dipakai untuk memverifikasi, memvalidasi Ibu Maya? Lalu kemudian, selamat siang Bapak dan Ibu narasumber. Terima kasih atas forum yang diselenggarakan hari ini, sangat menarik dan bagus. Bapak moderator, izin bertanya kepada seluruh narsum mengenai perdagangan karbon ini. Bagaimana implementasinya di negara-negara Eropa, sehingga menjadi sebuah wacana yang layak diikuti oleh negara lain? Siapa market utamanya? 25, kita mulai transisi dari diesel dan coal to gas engine generator. Menurut saya ini dapat reduce carbon production jika sebagian besar pembangkit sudah shifting to gas atau nuklir. Bagaimana market karbon Indonesia ke depannya? Terima kasih. Lalu kemudian pertanyaan satu lagi, Kalau tidak salah, satu tujuan dari dekarbonisasi adalah mengurangi ketergantungan pada bahan bakar fosil. Sebagai contoh, di Sulawesi Utara telah ada percontohan industri pembuatan palm sugar yang menggunakan energi terbarukan dari Pertamina Geothermal Energy area Lahendok, yang produknya merupakan komoditi ekspor ke Eropa. Namun, informasi yang saya dapatkan bahwa pihak pengelola belum bisa mendapatkan akses untuk mengurus pajak karbon ataupun free allowance. Bagaimana pengalaman dengan industri di EU yang menggunakan renewable energy? Apakah ada skema yang bisa digunakan sebagai contoh? Eh, ada satu lagi pertanyaan, tapi mungkin ini nanti saya simpan setelah pertanyaan yang lainnya sudah terjawab. Saya berikan kesempatan pertama. So Maya, do you want to have another chance to breathe, or you can respond the question to
I
you
can
sekarang?
answer. I can answer some
Okay,
questions about the
please.
future of the Indonesian energy market. I unfortunately cannot answer, so I will leave that to you. So maybe just on the carbon price. So you refer to the tax, but for us it's not a tax, and it's quite important in the EU that it's not a tax. So it's really an emissions trading system. And so that means the price varies. So the price is not going to be the same now as it's going to be tomorrow, as it was yesterday. So we saw the graph earlier. It was close to, it was above 80 euros at some point. It's now more around 60 euros. And that's more or less where we, I think it should be, but it can go a bit down, it can go a bit up, but it's not too drastic, the changes. So who monitors the carbon tax? So we do that at the central level. So we even have the European Market Surveillance Authority even that looks at, is there anything dodgy going on? Is the price evaluating in a strange way? Is there any suspicion of market speculation? I mean, I said in our market, not only compliance entities participate, but we also have trading companies that can participate. So it's really important that we also have a central body that looks at the overall, price evolution, etc. And so we do that at the Commission level, but also a specific authority, EU authority that looks into this. On the MIV, we have a very complicated system, so I cannot really go into the details here and the context of this session. But basically the way it's done, so I said our compliance entities are installations, so they monitor their own emissions. However, they need to have a monitor plan in place that is approved. So it needs to be approved by the competent authority. So again, the EU system is a bit complicated, but so at the central level, so government level, more or less, needs to approve this monitoring plan. We also have verifiers that are involved. So basically, the company the installation monitors the emissions according to this monitoring plan. And once it has for an entire year, and at the end of the year, it has this emissions data checked by an independent verifier. So a verifier needs to meet certain conditions that are also set out in legislation. The verifier needs to be accredited by a government body as well. So only really legit verifiers can check that data and say, yes, this is okay, or there's something that is not correct in the data. And when and this verified data is then submitted in the central base, so to the commission. It's actually all collected in one registry. So we have one IT tool that keeps, on one hand, where we create our allowances, but where we also register all the emissions data. And then basically we compare emissions data against compliance obligations, and then there needs to be matched in terms of allowances that are surrendered for each ton of CO2 equivalent at the end of the compliance year. But yes, it's quite a complicated system, and I'm happy to do a more detailed session on it at another occasion. What else? I'm sure there was another question that I now forgot. I would leave it at that, but maybe you can remind me if I missed one question.
You're muted, Mas Mod.
Yeah, I think you already covered overall actually all of the question, including about the carbon tax questions. So now I would like to give a chance. Bu Kuki first or Pak Paul first? Feel free. Pak Paul. Okay, Pak Paul.
Okay, thank you. One thing that we have not mentioned, actually, we forgot to mention, is that to be effective, one thing that we need to have is actually a kind of penalty. In EU, they call it penalty for €100 for per ton for not meeting the cap. That's in our case, we call it tax. So we have
Yes.
cap, trade, and tax, right? So, but one of the very important issues that we have now, why we have a discussion about effectiveness of the ETS in Indonesia, is because we actually have to have a kind of regulation related to this tax. So in your case, in the EU, it will be the penalty. So it means so far there is no clear, not yet, so the regulation about the penalty, about the tax for not meeting the cap is not issued yet. There was already discussion in the past about how Minister of Finance would determine how much would be the tax for not meeting the cap, or how they want to charge the tax from the beginning already for the let's say for the deficit of the allowance. So, but it is still missing now. So this becomes a problem actually for the implementation of the ETS in Indonesia. Without this let's say enforcement with the penalty or tax, then the MEMR could set the cap and allowance and so on. But if it is not, if it doesn't have any instrument to enforce that, then we can question about the effectiveness of the ETS in Indonesia. That's the first things. And then about the carbon market, as mentioned by the colleague here. So are we talking about the compliance market or the voluntary market, or actually so when it comes to the compliance, then we actually have to look at the ETS as one of the let's say options that we could implement economy wide. We start now only with the power sector, but in the future there will be a really let's say roadmap that has to be developed by the government, how we should expand the existing ETS from power sector to, let's say, for example, energy intensive industries like cement, steel, and iron and steel, and maybe ammonia and others. So we need to have a kind of roadmap how to integrate all of this sector in one, and efficiency of the implementation of the ETS in Indonesia. And then when it comes to the carbon market, let's say related to the for such carbon credit, so that we can really go into the carbon develop our domestic carbon market. So if there is no let's say way to create the domestic demand, then what will we do with all of the potential carbon credit that we could develop? For example, I know that a lot of, let's say, company have developed a forestry-based project that would generate carbon credit, and for now they target to sell it to the international market. But what if the international market could not absorb all of the carbon credit? Then what to do with all of the carbon credit? So just like in the past, for example, when suddenly EU said that EU would not accept any CER, certified emission reduction, from non-Annex 1 country other than LDC, then so directly the price of CER collapsed. So the same thing would happen here if, for example, the carbon credit that we generate in Indonesia cannot be absorbed by international market. What to do with our carbon credit? So this is the important thing that we need to discuss, that we really need to also look at domestic carbon market, how we can create the domestic demand. So we should not only, let's say, look at the international market. Because at the end, our corporate also need to decarbonize, need to, let's say, use the carbon credit to offset at least their scope 3 emissions, or emissions they cannot do it on their own. So this is the thing that we need to think about and discuss with government and see how it goes with this with the development of our domestic carbon market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bang Paul. Ibu Puki.
Ya, barangkali untuk menjawab beberapa pertanyaan di sini ya tadi yang saya lihat gitu, karena mungkin kita juga perlu kembali lagi dari beberapa pertanyaan di sini untuk memahami sebetulnya apa yang dimaksud dengan pasar karbon itu sendiri begitu. Jadi barangkali nanti Bapak dan Ibu juga bisa melihat lagi rekaman dari teman-teman yang di Kabar Bursa ini ya gitu ya, karena di YouTube-nya Kabar Bursa dialog kita 3 minggu yang lalu tuh ada Bapak dan Ibu, jadi mungkin bisa dilihat lagi karena di situ kami kemarin coba menjelaskan juga supaya bisa dipahami bahwa memang kalau pasar karbon ini, kalau tadi ada pertanyaan siapa gitu yang akan jadi pembelinya dan segala macam, itu ada di sana. Memang kalau kita bicara misalnya sekarang kira-kira siapa yang jadi, tadi itu kalau nggak salah ada pertanyaan kan, siapa market utamanya, apakah diwajibkan atau tidak gitu. Kalau kita lihat apa yang terjadi di Uni Eropa tadi disampaikan oleh Mbak Maya gitu kan, memang ini adalah satu sistem yang sudah dibangun dan diwajibkan gitu kalau kita bicara EU ETS. Tapi tadi yang disampaikan oleh Bang Paul misalnya gitu, kalau kita bicara pasarnya itu pasar voluntary atau pasar sukarela, memang itu lebih diarahkan untuk membantu perusahaan-perusahaan untuk mencapai target-target dekarbonisasinya begitu. Jadi kalau tadi ada pertanyaan yang terkait RUPTL nanti gimana gitu pasar carbon market ke depannya gitu. Nantinya targetnya kan adalah dekarbonisasi. Jadi semakin lama memang akan mencapai titik net zero emission gitu. Jadi ini akan terus ada sampai net zero emission, dan sebetulnya kalau kita bicara di global arahnya itu bukan lagi net zero emission tapi nantinya itu adalah negative emission gitu. Jadi ada terus dalam artian harus dibangun begitu, harus dibangun bahwa targetnya tadi harus diubah terus, harus semakin diketatkan, yang tadinya semakin turun sampai net zero, nanti pada waktunya harus sampai negative emission. Jadi saya rasa itu mungkin yang terkait tadi ya, kita belajar dari apa yang dilakukan di Eropa, bagaimana tadi juga Mbak Maya menyampaikan salah satunya targetnya ini ke depannya sesudah 2030, bahkan di Eropa juga harus menyesuaikan lagi begitu ITS-nya untuk menyesuaikan dengan target mereka di 2040 gitu. Kita juga harus seperti itu nanti ke depannya. Lalu tadi juga ada salah satu yang pertanyaan terkait yang geothermal Pak ya, yang gula aren dengan menggunakan geothermal, yang tadi mengenai akses untuk pajak karbon atau free allowance, ini memang tidak semudah itu begitu Pak. Artinya memang pajak karbon di kita belum berjalan. Free allowance itu juga memang tadi seperti yang disampaikan oleh Bang Paul, itu hanya ada saat ini untuk ITS di pembangkit-pembangkit batu bara. Gitu. Jadi bukan berarti penghasil atau produsen gula aren itu bisa dapat free allowance gitu. Itu tidak begitu. Bahkan pada saat kita nanti bicara misalnya mau ekspor ke Uni Eropa, itu juga bukan produsen gula aren itu juga akan dapat, karena tidak semua produk yang akan ekspor ke Uni Eropa itu memerlukan unit karbon, sertifikat tadi gitu. Jadi ada aturan mainnya dan tadi nanti mungkin pada kesempatan lain gitu ya kalau kita bikin sesi soal SIBAM barangkali ya Bang Paul ya soal Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism mungkin nanti bisa kita juga bikin sesi menjelaskan apa itu begitu. Jadi memang agak kompleks Bapak dan Ibu gitu isunya dan nanti mungkin kita perlu belajar lebih banyak lagi nanti dari Mbak Maya begitu. Mungkin itu aja yang saya tambahin Mas Mot, silahkan.
Baik, terima kasih banyak Bu Kuki. Sekarang I will give a challenge to Ibu Kuki, Pak Paul, and Mbak Maya to answer next two questions within 10 minutes maximum. I'm sorry for the audience. I only could serve for moderating only two remaining questions for this webinar. First, from Kevin Setiadi, addressed to Maya. I'm currently pursuing my master in air and space law at Leiden University. I have three questions regarding EU ETS. First, in the context of cargo, how the EU ETS be implemented to comply with the CBAM regulation to address the scope 3 emission? The second, does the EU considering the starting the clock of the EU ETS towards international aviation, which apply to EU regulation extraterritorially? Third, how the EU plan to incorporate the CORSIA into the EU ETS and how foreign airlines comply with such incorporation to remain flying to the EU? Thank you. That's specific to Maya. And now, address to Ibu Kuki dan Pak Paul. What is the capacity of the absorption for the domestic Indonesian market? And in absence of CDM, how can we see voluntary market to bridge that gap of any? The final question. And finally, how does the pricing of credits be defined in both cases linked to international or cap? From Chaitani di Sawangar. So please, within only 3 or 5 minutes, Maya, the floor is yours.
I must admit, I don't think I need that much time. So on aviation, quickly. So we included aviation in the EU ETS in 2012, initially covering both domestic and international flights. Then there's been some breakthrough at international level with the development of CORSIA, so the international market-based measure. And as it was developing, we decided to stop the clock. So we decided not to apply the EU ETS to international flights to allow for the international system to develop. So I said it's a stop the clock measure. So we said we discontinue the application to international flights, but we regularly review to see how the implementation of first the development and now the implementation of course it develops. And that's something we'll be looking at again, but I cannot really say much more about it right now. It's something that is in the process. It is true that now with the US stepping out, the implementation doesn't look very rosy for CORSIA. So that's certainly a space that needs to be watched in the future. Similarly for CBAM, actually, we as DG Klima, so I'm in the Climate Action Department of the European Commission. We're not in charge of CBAM. It's our sister department for taxation. And they're indeed looking at also the future of CBAM, so expanding the scope to new sectors, but also looking at the emissions that will be covered. So again, I cannot say much more here and would refer you also to our colleagues in DG TaxSuit.
So thank you so much, Maya. So next 3 minutes for either Bu Kuki or Pak Paul. Who will come first?
So,
okay, Ibu Kuki, please.
Oh yeah, please.
Ibu
please,
Kuki
please.
or Pak Paul? Pak Paul, sorry.
No, please, Ibu Kuki.
Paul is the CDM guy. I mean, like if you ask me, I will say no capacity.
Come on. 6
Okay.
minutes only. Who will come first?
Okay. So to that question from Chaitani, so when it comes to the capacity of absorption, and that's actually the problem that we have now. As I mentioned before, we need to establish a domestic market. So means actually create market demand. And that's what we do not have yet. But that's why it will be the project developer, the carbon project developers are now still focusing on the international market. So because, for example, I'm not so sure whether you watch already how the carbon exchange work in Indonesia that has been established since 2023. In fact, not so many transactions actually have been, let's say, happen in the exchange, and it shows that the demand creation is not there yet. So that's why it is it becomes very important for us now to look at the demand domestically, and this is now the thing that we really need to advise our government to see how we could really work on this part. So, for example, now, in fact, for the ETS in power sector, the offset could actually be used 100%. So, but the problem is with the cap that is so relaxed. So, as I mentioned in my slide before, even the transaction is very low. That's why the price is very low. It shows that the demand is not there. So we have to see both from the ETS perspective and also from the carbon credit, carbon unit perspective, how government really could regulate this demand. And once it is done, that's how we can calculate how much would be the absorption capacity. Of course, when it comes to the voluntary market, even now, actually, there are already companies, corporate, that buy carbon credit in Indonesia. I remember back in 2021, I met someone during the COP in Glasgow. They told us, for example, that they bought carbon credit from Singapore because they need to offset their emissions. And it is a domestic company. But international company that operate in Indonesia, because they have a kind of, let's say, net zero commitment, they also have to cover their, in particular, their scope 3 emissions. But how much is the scope 3, the potential for a market for scope 3 emissions? We don't know, because no one really look at that demand, because so far there is no integrated strategy in Indonesia yet for the carbon market. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Bang Paul. And it's quite dilemmatic now. We still have a few more questions, but I'm afraid that in next two more minutes we should end this question. But okay, just one to directly to Ibu Kuki. Only this is the last question. I'm sorry, Bapak Ibu. This is the last question that will be addressed in this webinar. Ibu Kuki, sebagaimana kita ketahui, Undang-Undang Pajak Karbon sudah disetujui dikeluarkan oleh DPR. Tetapi pemerintah belum menerapkannya. Apa alasannya dan kapan kira-kira Undang-Undang Pajak Karbon ini dapat dilaksanakan di Indonesia? Apakah lembaga-lembaga instansi yang akan terlibat nanti sudah disiapkan, yang ditugaskan mengukur actual emisi, yang memverifikasi dan memvalidasi hasil perhitungan, dan yang menerima pembayaran uang pajak karbon ini? Tanda tanya. Bagaimana Mbak Kuki bisa menjawab dalam 5 menit, the max?
Bisa 1 menit. Saya nggak tahu
Yes.
jawabannya karena saya bukan Kementerian Keuangan. Itu aja.
Okay.
Karena ini kan sesuai dengan undang-undang, ini adalah tugasnya Kementerian Keuangan. Itu aja sih. Itu mungkin ya.
Oke, baik, terima kasih banyak Ibu Kuki. Mohon maaf Bapak Ibu, kita sudah di penghujung acara webinar ini. Mohon maaf kami tidak bisa menjawab seluruh pertanyaan yang ada, tapi mungkin bisa disimpan dulu pertanyaan ini, karena ingat kita masih punya, sekarang yang kedua, berarti kita masih punya 6 seri webinar lagi. So don't forget to save the date. Nanti kalau misalnya kita sudah woro-woro kapan pelaksanaan seri webinar yang ketiga. I would like to express my huge gratitude to Maya, Alexandra, Thank you so much, Mbak Maya, for enlighten us. Kalau in bahasa we say please jangan kapok, so means I don't know what's in English. Please jangan kapok. So please come again to our webinar if there's a chance.
Thank you. It
Terima
was a
kasih
pleasure.
banyak. Terima kasih banyak Pak Paul Butar-Butar, terima kasih banyak Ibu Puki Syahmun, dan terima kasih banyak atas bantuan semua teman-teman termasuk interpreter, lalu kemudian dari teman-teman IKRES dan IRIT, dan yang paling penting terima kasih para audiens yang tetap setia. Saya notice banyak regular customer yang datang ke sini sebenarnya. Dan mungkin kami akan tetap tunggu lagi nanti di pertemuan webinar seri ketiga. Have a greatest day today and looking forward to meet you all in the near future. Bye now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Maya.